Oh, hello, welcome, and thank you, all of you, for tuning in and joining us for our very latest Oceanographic Roundtable discussion. It's lovely to have such a robust audience join us online for this event. This is, of course, the latest in our ongoing series of Oceanographic Roundtable events. And for those of you keeping track, this is the all-important number 9 in our series of Roundtable discussions. All 8 of our previous roundtable discussions are available to watch back on demand via the Oceanographic website or to enjoy in podcast format across both Spotify and Apple Podcasts. These roundtable discussions are a chance each week for oceanographic audiences around the globe to join us as we dissect and dive into some of the biggest headlines across the ocean news and ocean storytelling space. Now, already in this series of live discussions, we have tackled the topics of the UK sewage crisis, the effectiveness of marine protected areas, the pervasiveness of microplastics, and latterly, the critical issue of fin whaling in Iceland, and the severe overfishing crisis here in UK waters. Now, I can't believe it's only taken us 9 roundtable sessions, but finally, we are diving into a positive news story. And I have finally had my way and am able to platform such a hopeful development. And the best part of it is that it's happening right here on our own back doorstep. So today we are taking the moment to celebrate a win of our very own and turn our attention to conservation and recovery developments taking place along the Sussex coastline. It's a habitat rich in biodiversity, including dolphins, and at one point last year, humpback whales. But it is indeed still a big and emotive topic, the kind that we are known for at the Oceanographic Roundtable. So here's a bit of background on the story so far. We are standing at an interesting moment in the story of Sussex's coastline. Last year, a new bylaw came into force protecting 101 square miles of seabed off of Beachy Head East from bottom trawling and scalloping. It was a significant decision and one that extended formal protection to some of the most ecologically remarkable marine habitats in Northern Europe. Chalk reefs, sandstone ecosystems, habitats that are, in the truest sense of the word, irreplaceable. Once gone, they do not come back. So that bylaw did not arrive in isolation. It has been built on a foundation laid in 2021 when the Sussex Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authority introduced the nearshore trawling bylaw, removing destructive bottom trawling from more than 300 square kilometres of seabed stretching from Selsey to Shoreham by Sea. Taken together, these two pieces of legislation mean that nearly 30% of Sussex's inshore waters are now protected from trawling, and that is, by any measure, a meaningful achievement. But this afternoon is not simply a celebration of what has been done. As good as it is to share some good news for a change, it's a conversation about what comes next and about the harder questions that sit beneath the headline figures. Because the story of Sussex's seabed is at its heart a story about loss. By 2019, an estimated 96% of the kelp forests that once stretched along this coastline had disappeared, driven by decades of trawling, by marine heat waves, by pollution and sedimentation. An ecosystem that had taken centuries to develop was within a generation almost entirely gone. That is the baseline from which recovery is now being measured, and it is worth holding that in mind as we discuss the progress that has been made so far. And there is genuine progress to discuss. 5 years on from the 2021 bylaw, early signs of ecological recovery are beginning to surface. Mussel beds are re-establishing themselves across parts of the seabed. Populations of black sea bream are increasing. Fishers who abandoned the water years ago because there was simply nothing left to catch are beginning to return. These are not dramatic transformations. Recovery at this scale is measured in decades, not years. But they are real and they do matter. And what they tell us is that nature, when given the space to regenerate, will take it. And this is what the evidence, cautiously and carefully gathered, is beginning to show. But protection from trawling is not protection from everything. Pollution continues, sedimentation continues, marine heat waves driven by a warming ocean are becoming more frequent and more intense. The bylaw addresses one pressure on a coastline that faces many. And so the question is not simply whether what has been done is good, because it is, but whether it is enough, whether the pace of protection matches the pace of loss, whether the Sussex model, which is increasingly being looked at as a template for marine management elsewhere in the UK, can be sustained, scaled and strengthened. So thankfully, to help us think through those questions, I am joined this afternoon by 3 people who have been at the centre of this work. So I'm joined by Dr. George Balchin from Sussex IFCA, whose authority has been responsible for developing and implementing both bylaws and who understands better than most the regulatory, political and community complexities involved in turning conservation ambition into law. Hey, George.
Hi, Rob.
How you doing?
Yeah, good, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no, thank you for joining this afternoon. Thanks for your energy and contributing to the conversation. Next up, I'm joined by Dr. Lewis White, Seascape Research Lead for Sussex Bay. Lewis has been tracking the ecological evidence of from these protected zones and has described Beachy Head East as a real opportunity to demonstrate what effective evidence-led marine management can achieve. Hey, Lewis, how you doing?
Good afternoon. How are you?
Yeah, very good, thanks. I need a drink after that intro, but we've got one more to go. We're also joined by Henry Brocklebank from Sussex Wildlife Trust, who brings the perspective of an organisation whose commitment to this coastline stretches well beyond any single piece of legislation, and who will, I suspect, push us to think about the bigger picture. Between them, they represent the science, the regulation, and the conservation ambition that this moment requires. And I am sure that with each of you here this afternoon, what will follow will be a conversation that is honest about the challenges, clear-eyed about the evidence, and useful, not just for those of us in this room, but for the future of the coastline that has too long been taken for granted. Hey, Henry, I've got to say hi.
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you so much for coming along and joining us. I am, by the way, Rob Hutchins, community editor here at Oceanographic, and it's my role to be asking all of the questions this afternoon. But to make that easier for me, do throughout this discussion, post your own questions for the panel, post those into the chat, and I will endeavour to get as many of those answered for you as possible over the next 30 minutes of discussion. Right, introductions made. Thank you all for joining us, and I am going to get my breath back, have a little sip of water, and going to let you guys jump into this conversation. So to kick us off, a question to each of you would be that we have nearly 30% of Sussex's inshore waters now protected from trawling. So for each of you, starting with you, Lewis, as you appear on my screen, what does that number represent? Is it a milestone, or is this the beginning of something larger?
Oh, it's a fantastic question. I think the cop-out answer is both. It's a really exciting achievement. This has been years in the making. It's had loads of evidence and loads of hard work from Sussex IFCA and others build up to where they are now. So this is really exciting. There is always more that we can do. So this is a real hopeful stamp of what's left to come.
Awesome. And George, same question to you, just to kick us off.
Sorry, I was just muting myself. I'll try to not make a habit of that. Yeah, so I think the 30 by 30 target is really important, and it's nice that we have 30% of our district now protected from trawling. So trawling and dredges are sort of those towed gears that tend to be more impactful. And I should also say that at the moment, 50% of the district is protected from dredges year round, and the other 50% is protected seasonally. So just sort of not to sell us short. So we are working towards those 30 by 30 targets to an extent, but I also think it's quite important to always point out when we're talking about that 30 by 30 policy, excuse me, that written into that is a sort of nuance around allowing sustainable and traditionally important resource extraction in those areas. And I feel that's what we've achieved in Beachy Head East. We have removed the pressures which we feel might be damaging the conservation features, but we have allowed those culturally and socially important fishing activities to continue, which don't features of the MCZ.
Yeah, thanks, George, and thanks both actually for giving us an overview there. And then to turn to you, Henry, just to get that, by way of leaping into the conversation there, just to ask you the same question about 30% of Sussex's inshore waters are now protected from trawling. What does that number represent to you? Is that a milestone, or is this the beginning of something larger?
I would say it's an amazing reflection on the individuals and the tenacity of the Sussex Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authority. It's exemplary from them. They are a statutory body. There are other statutory bodies that have a role that need to be pushing out more of these protections, and looking at IFCA and seeing, you know, what they have done through imagination and really, really good communication and collaboration, and balancing that necessity to balance quite difficult topics together, but doing it anyway and not being scared of the conversations. And it's wonderful to have nearly 30% of our nearshore waters protected from trawling, but there's actually enormous marine protected areas in Sussex that have no protection, that are either SACs, SPAs, or further offshore, we have marine conservation zones that have no protection. And that's not, the IFCA can't help us there. What the IFCA can do is shine a light and give that comparison of like, well, look what's happened in our nearshore. Now, how does that make us feel about our offshore protection, which is a larger area? So I think my feelings coming from it is, well done, IFCA. Come on, everybody, catch up.
Oh, I like that. I like that's how we're starting the conversation as well. That feels good, good energy. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate the overview from each of you, and for giving us your time and energy. Actually, I know that you're all incredibly busy, and particularly at this time of year. So, so why don't we talk about how we actually got here? And then to do that, maybe we can come to you, George, and to talk about the Beachy Head East bylaw, which took some time to develop and consult on. What were the most significant obstacles that you encountered? Were these scientific, political, or community-based? And how did you navigate those?
I think it's a good question. And so to explain, the Beachy Head East was designated as an MCZ in 2019, and it's just been confirmed at the end of last year. So it was sort of the best part of 5-6 years to get that bylaw from designation through to a point where you have an enforceable bylaw. A large part of that is just the process. You know, it takes a long time to develop an evidence base, to consult on that evidence base, to come up with proposals and feedback, you know, views on those proposals from the consultation back into the bylaw. So I think a good chunk of that time, it can be attributed to just thoroughly and carefully following the process. I do think there were also some obstacles in the development of the Beachy Head East bylaw. I think those were probably predominantly the evidence base. I think one lesson that I took away from this management is really, really digging into the evidence base and really understanding individual data points and how reliable they are and what they show. I think probably the other obstacle, it's fair to say, to this bylaw becoming enforceable was the quality assurance process, which took about 3 years, which is essentially when it goes off to government to be quality assured in terms of fisheries management, but also the legal aspects of making a bylaw. And I understand that that's just a resource intensive process. And, you know, like it's something that needs to be done properly, but perhaps that could be expedited in some way and bring those protections in slightly earlier.
Mm. Oh, thanks for that, George. Thanks for taking us through that story. And you mentioned evidence-based there a couple of times, and I think that might be a nice segue to turn to you, Lewis, and to ask you what does the evidence base for this specific site actually look like, and what is ecologically at stake if these chalk reef habitats are lost?
Well, I think the IFCA has done a very fantastic job, and part of their job is to balance the needs and evidence between ecological, social, and economic information, and all of that had to be taken into consideration in this and everything the IFCA do. And I think that can't be underestimated, how complex it is to compare those 3 different streams of evidence and then use that to come to a decision. So I think we really have to not underestimate the breadth of evidence that is taken into consideration when in this bylaw and the rest of them. In Beachy Head, I think you did a great job in your intro there about all of the irreplaceable and protected habitats which are in that space. And again, when we're looking at the evidence, what was being considered here was how does an activity like trawling impact those things that are designated to be protected against? And that's where the balances really come in, and you can see the spatial dimensions of where protection has been brought in this case, because of how that evidence was balanced. So it's really complex, but again, I think the IFCA did a really fantastic job. What's going to be interesting now is monitoring over the next however many years what the changes are in that location because of the bylaw being brought in. So what does not having this damaging activity in this MPA, what will that look like in 5-10 years time? And how do we start to evidence that, as Henry was saying, to start bringing in protections elsewhere? What's I think is really important as well, though, is fishing is just one pressure on the environment. And so again, it's one of the things that the IFA's job is to manage is fishing. We now need to be looking at the other pressures that are not just on that MPA, but that we have elsewhere in Sussex.
Yeah, no, awesome, thanks. And we'll come on to those other pressures as well during the course of the conversation. But to get your steer, Henry, from a conservation perspective, how significant do you think, or is the Beachy Head East bylaw? Does it go far enough, and does it represent a compromise? That's a spicy question.
I mean, as a conservation organisation, obviously we often want to push things further, but we're not the ones that have the statutory responsibility to balance the needs of the fishing community with the needs of the wildlife. So actually, I'm really impressed with the role that IFCA has taken. I think the Zone 1, Zone 2 element is a really important aspect of this, which is just for anybody who's listening. There's Zone 1 and 2. There's it's not no trawling in the entire marine conservation zone. There is a zonation to where activity can and can't take place, and I feel that that's a really important element of it, because that is the product of the conversation that Sussex IFCA was taking part in with that local community, and that's really important. For me, the biggest reflection point of this is how excited and informed the Sussex community are about a new piece of fisheries management legislation. And they've had, I guess, as a Sussex community, we've had 5 years of getting very, very excited about the Sussex nearshore trawling bylaw. But to the extent that immediately, as soon as this fantastic new bylaw came in place, the local media knew immediately how significant that was, and that this did take us to nearly 30% of our inshore fisheries protected, not just in name, but actually some actual element of protection, and recognizing how special that is and how lucky we are to have it. And so that, for me, is the increase in ocean literacy is so palpable in Sussex that even our media outlets are wanting to follow these stories about fisheries management, which were unheard of 6-7 years ago.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, actually, because that's what struck me. We recently hosted an Ocean Talks event over in Brighton, and it was around the Sussex coastline and the various developments. And two of our guests today were actually on the panel on the evening. But what struck me the most was just how tuned in and plugged into that conversation and to the developments that the audience and the local community really was. And I guess that's it's such a testament not only to the work that you guys, each of you respectively, are doing through your various organizations, but also the way that you're sharing that information and the stories that you're allowing to be told to those local communities as well, and actually embracing them and bringing them making them a part of the journey. I think it's an incredible testament to what can be done, cross-community collaboration, which is why at some point in this discussion, I'm sure we're going to veer into the topic of how this can be translated or looked at as a blueprint for the rest of the UK. But before we get there, I wanted to turn to you, Lewis, and ask you about the signs of life that we're seeing then from 5 years on from the 2021 bylaw. What are the most encouraging indicators of recovery that you've observed, and where are you still waiting for signs of change to sort of emerge?
Thanks, Rob. So 5 years is not a long time in the marine world, and I'm going to touch a bit on the ecological but also the social side of recovery and change. So it's going on from first what Henry was saying about the excitement that communities are having on this bylaw and the other work that's going on. Sussex is a really connected space. The communities really care about the environment here. We conducted an ocean literacy survey last year, which showed people here are actively making changes to their lives to benefit the marine environment, and that the vast majority of people believe that protection of the marine environment is a really important aspect of what needs to be going on here. So we're looking at this community change. And I have to say that the last 5 years of the nearshore trawling bylaw has probably been the biggest driver of that change, because the positive news stories that have come out of that. So that's really exciting to see. Ecologically, again, I think George and Henry both have a lot of stuff that they can say about this as well from their perspectives. But we are seeing positive changes, positive signs of recovery, and some of the stocks and species that you mentioned previously, blue mussels and black bream, coming back in greater numbers. But I think I'd like to hear what George has to say maybe about those signs.
I'd be inclined to agree.
Yeah, so I think Lewis has just made this point, but I think this is a really important point to reiterate, is that we expect habitat and ecological recovery. It will depend from context to context, but generally we would expect that to be a decadal process, not sort of a yearly process. So we are really in the infancy of this bylaw. And I think that anecdotally, we are seeing a lot of changes, like mussel beds where they weren't before, mussel beds which are increasing in their coverage. We have lots more black bream in the district at the moment, which I think is very likely due to management in another MCZ called Kingmere MCZ, for which black bream is a designated feature. I think it's also probably partially due to the nearshore trawling bylaw, and it's also partially due to range shifts. So yeah, in terms of signs of recovery, they are there. I was actually just reviewing what will be a peer-reviewed paper on the nearshore trawling bylaw, and I think that without sort of scooping that paper, that we are really early in the process, and there are signs of recovery, but perhaps we need to let this bylaw play out over a longer time period before we really understand what the benefits are. So yeah, like those early signs are there, but we must allow enough time for this decadal process to take place, and such that we can most accurately quantify what the benefits actually are.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Obviously, a very diplomatic response there, George, and much to be expected. But thank you so much. And so this part of the conversation, I've actually given the header the hard questions. I don't think they're going to be that hard, and I don't expect anyone to fall out. But I want to ask you, Henry, that trawling is one pressure amongst many, as Lewis and George have both sort of alluded to. Does a truly comprehensive marine protection strategy look like to you?
Well, a truly comprehensive marine strategy has got to be based around it's got to be a multi-capital approach. There's natural capital, human capital, built capital, social capital, etc. And a truly balanced marine protective strategy has got to look at all of them in balance, because we have a really big aggregate industry in Sussex. It's an offshore industry, but for example, that will be creating plumes of sedimentation. So we know sedimentation has been a really significant issue, increasing in Sussex, and but in order to resolve those issues, no one organisation can do that on their own. These are huge existential issues. It will only work with really, really strong collaboration, because we're looking to regulators to change the way they regulate areas of activity in the marine space that I'm sure they've never gone unchallenged, but actually changing the way that regulation takes place is a big job. Lots of us, for example, involved in Sussex, our boundaries are Sussex. We're the Sussex Wildlife Trust. Lewis is Sussex Bay, it's Sussex IFCA. Actually, we're really lucky in the Sussex Kelp Recovery Project. We have a big national/international NGO working with us in the Blue Marine Foundation, which is really helpful to be able to step out of Sussex and go, right, the changes that we need to make isn't through influencing local decision makers. Actually, we need to take this national if we want change here. Sort of answers some of your question.
It did, thank you. Yeah, fab. Thanks. I'll just eyeing up my next question. I was debating whether we go into Charlie's question, but I think before we go there, I'm going to ask you, George, about enforcement. an enforcement that is often the weak link in marine protection. What powers does IFCA have to monitor and enforce compliance, and are those powers sufficient?
I start talking on mute then. Yes, so we are responsible for monitoring our management. So that's both in terms of like the ecological effects and the effects on fishing activity. So I think this question is a bit more focused on enforcement. And I think that the conversation around enforcement is a really valid one. I do also think sometimes it can be a little bit of a distraction. So just to give an impression, in Sussex, we have 1,800 square kilometres to cover, and we have a team of 6 people who are leading on the enforcement of that area. Now, obviously, you can't be everywhere all at once, and therefore you will always be relying on what you could call like the threat of enforcement, or perhaps a slightly more friendlier term would be voluntary compliance to a large extent. And so for me, that the point I'm making there is around the importance of things like a co-management and co-design approach, and making sure that you bring fishers along in the decision-making process, making sure that they have a sense of pride and a sense of ownership in that management process, and the legislation that's developed on the back of that. And therefore you have voluntary compliance. Again, that's not to say that, you know, there may also be bad actors in certain cases. And in terms of enforcement, we have 3 fisheries patrol vessels. We generally go out on patrol whenever the weather is suitable. We can board vessels, we can inspect premises, we can inspect cars, we can seize catch, we can seize gear. So we can issue warnings, fines, we can take people to court, and we have done that in the past. And so there are lots of different avenues through which the IFCA can enforce their bylaws. The important thing for us is to be proportional and, again, evidence-based. So the enforcement action is suitable to the infringement, which, you know, is to say that those more in serious infringement might require a more serious response from the IFCA. But yeah, just to kind of come back to that point of, it's really about voluntary compliance and the fact that you can't be everywhere all at once. However, there is a caveat to that at the moment, which is around remote electronic monitoring, things like IVMS, which give you very accurate spatial information about where vessels are, also gear in, gear out technology. So, for example, when a trawl might be in the water versus out of the water, and that can give you a lot more data on what people are doing. And I think that's really a benefit to both fishers and fisheries managers and the environment. But yeah, enforcement is very important. It's something that we do and we invest a lot of resource in, but ultimately you are always going to be relying on those relationships and that social capital that you've built with people to bring them along with the management process and get their buy-in, and therefore downstream of that is their compliance.
Yeah, great, thank you. And just well, sticking with you, George, then, and off the back of that buy-in from those communities, is there an appetite within the IFCA to push beyond protection, to push that protection beyond 30%, and what would need to be in place, whether that's scientifically or politically, to make that so?
So I think this really comes back to our central remit, which is to balance the promotion of sustainable fisheries and the conservation of sea fisheries resources. So the context in which we would look to protect more than 30% of the district from a particular gear, let's say in this instance trawling, would be if we felt there was the demonstrable benefit to both the environment and to fishers. I'm not going to preempt whether that is the case or not, but I should also say that, you know, so I think this is a really important story about beachy head east. Actually, it's not explicitly related to the question, but I'll take this opportunity to tell it. So beachy head east was sort of the brainchild of the local fishing community. So people like Graham Doswell, who was a prominent fisher in Eastbourne, and Paul Joy, who was and still is a prominent fisher in Hastings, and those fishing communities generally. They were aware of a certain type of beam trawling which had become common in the area in which beachy head east is now designated. They were very concerned about that. They have an understanding of the habitats, how they contribute to recruitment, how they're important for both biodiversity and fisheries recruitment. They obviously communicated that in their own way, and that's all of that information was fed into the Balance Seas organisation, which was at that time responsible for essentially designated different sites. So I am open to protecting more of the district, more than 30% of the districts from trawling, but it would have to be to again meet both those dual ambitions of promoting sustainable fishing and protecting the marine environment. And I absolutely believe that could be born out of a movement from fishers, as opposed to being something that is kind of that is applied to fishers against their will. You know, like this. It's really important to remember that fishermen are the custodians of the ocean, and oftentimes the most important protections are coming off the back of their observations and their motivations. So yes, I would be, as long as it fit the IFCA remit, and as long as we had suitable evidence to provide to provide evidence of a demonstrable benefit.
Mm. Oh, thanks, George. Thanks for the insight there, and for answering what I acknowledge and accept was a bit of a tricky question. So so thank you. And to come to you then, Lewis, then to talk about Sussex Bay, sitting at the intersection of science, community, and policy. How do you translate complex ecological data into something meaningful for fishers, policymakers, and the public?
Wow, that's a big question.
Yeah.
So I think part one of that is understanding the system that you're working in, and that it's really complex. We've got, not just in Sussex, but in the marine environment coastally around the country, you've got really busy spaces, and that's growing amount of activity in those spaces. You've got really mixed users. Fisheries is just one of the users of the marine environment. But you've got expanding offshore wind, expansion of recreational activity, other kinds of boating, aggregate dredging. It's a very busy space. So what we're trying to look at is how is that space being used, what the pressures on the environment, but also what are the ecological benefits that we could see with effective restoration, management, protection. And we have to remember there that there's a whole suite of tools that you can use to get the desired outcome. Protection being probably one of the most extreme, because you're closing an area to an activity, but there are other aspects within that. Like I said before, that means that you're using quite a broad range of evidence. You have to understand the ecological system, how it's functioning, how it should be functioning, how people are using it, the social aspects of that, so the benefits they're getting from it. And you need to consider all of that in an environment that is changing due to climate change and due to changing pressures coming off from terrestrial environment. So it's absolutely a really complex space. But going back to, I think, what Henry was saying before, Sussex Bay is just one player within this large area, and all of us working together, all doing our individual pieces, is really how we're going to turn this evidence into meaningful action and outcome. And those actions are going to be really, really broad. We're currently developing our blueprint for seascape recovery with partners across the place, across the region, which is looking at how do we deliver this. And the things that are coming out of that are protection and management, but also education, building in guidance and understanding, and looking at pressure reduction from all the different sources. So there's a lot to happen, but it's a lot of small actions can build up to a really big positive change. And we really need to be looking at what our end goal is, because I think it's really easy bringing people along a journey when they're all signed up to that end overarching objective.
A great answer. Thanks for that, Lewis. I feel really hopeful with that. And actually, thanks for leaning into what Henry brought up there as well about that national viewpoint, and actually to turn to Charlie's question then, does this offer much of a blueprint then for something translatable to something more nationwide? How can we replicate this elsewhere around the UK? Henry.
I mean, that's a really interesting question, and one we've discussed within the Sussex Kelp Recovery Project quite often. what we find is that what has taken place here in Sussex has been taken as a blueprint, but what's happened with the nearshore trawling bylaw was the protection of an ecosystem. An ecosystem had disappeared. That was recognised. It was not a protection of a marine protected area like the Beachy Head East situation. So they are two different things. So I'm working on the basis that I imagine all around England where IFCAs exist, hopefully all IFCAs are looking at their marine protected areas and thinking about exactly this process of what can they do for their marine conservation zones. What I would really be heartened by, and George may know the answer to this, is where else in the UK are they looking at ecosystems that are either vulnerable or even have disappeared and need support in order to return, but they're not protected. They're gone, so there's no protection. So it's that approach by an IFCA, that's really, really novel. That's taking that ecosystem-led approach is the real game changer here. And that's the bit that I do not know if other IFCAs are taking it. But we are certainly, as the Sussex Kelp Recovery Project and individually as our own organisations, really talking outside of the county. So the Sussex Kelp Recovery Project is talking not just nationally to other areas of the UK, but we're talking to international audiences as well to demonstrate the significance of this approach, of this ecosystem-led approach, and how fisheries management really can be so powerful and impactful to marine ecological systems, but also the impact it has on the communities living along that area.
Yeah, go for it, George.
Yeah, I think Henry's done a really good job of explaining one of the key motivations behind the nearshore trawling bylaw, which was a move towards an ecosystem-based approach. That is slightly different from it's not different, but within that is the approach to MPA management, which IFCAs take, which is essentially a feature-based approach. So you would, for a marine protected area, you would figure out where the features are, which is generally habitats. So you'll have your habitats, and then you'll figure out where the fishing activity is occurring, and where you have a vulnerable habitat over which a impactful fishing gear is happening. That's where you would introduce management. So, for example, for Beachy Head East, you would have something like chalk reef and the potential for trawling to happen over the top of that, which would be considered a red risk interaction, and you would develop management on that basis. Now, all IFCAs use that model for development of marine protected area management. The ecosystem-based management approach is something slightly different to that, and how that manifests at different IFCAs will change. It just so happens that at Sussex, it manifested. One of the ways in which it manifested was the nearshore trawling bylaw, which Henry accurately pointed out is a piece of spatial management. It isn't a marine protected area, so it takes that approach of protecting habitats, and that then sort of layers of benefits will be built on top of that, whether that's recruitment, biodiversity, etc. But yeah, just to point out the slight nuance between the process of developing management for marine protected areas, which is fairly consistent across the IFCAs, and the influence of ecosystem-based management on the way that different IFCAs do management, which is, again, like I said, slightly different in different places. And in Sussex, one of the ways in which that manifested was this big piece of spatial management to exclude trawling, which we felt was one of the gears which threatened things like recruitment in those nursery habitats, those nearshore, really productive, really valuable habitats. So I just wanted to clarify that point.
Yeah, no, great. I'm glad you did, because I was going to throw it onto you, and I felt bad about putting you on the spot. So I'm glad you took that on. I appreciate that. To ask, I was going to ask you, Henry. I was going to ask you about what lessons have been the most important lessons that you've taken from the Sussex Kelp Recovery Project so far.
Oh, brilliant. That's such a good question. I'm going to pick on two.
Yeah.
First of all, I don't think I'd ever appreciated in my career the critical importance between anecdotal evidence and empirical evidence, because in the terrestrial environment, empirical evidence is so much easier to get, because you can just walk into a field and measure the tree or whatever. You can't do that in the marine space. The whole monitoring and surveillance element is more complicated, it is more costly, and involving doing citizen science, for example. If you think all the biological recording that happens across the UK that informs our conservation, that most of that is voluntary activity, structured but voluntary.
Mm-hmm.
In the marine space, most of the voluntary activity that is under the waves is providing us with anecdotal information. You can't ignore that information because it's really, really important. I went diving and I saw loads of mussels. In fact, all the dives I've done this year, I'm seeing these mussel beds everywhere. You cannot ignore that evidence, but to demonstrate it empirically is really difficult. It very costly, etc. So what I've learned through the nearshore trawling bylaw work that we've done is we have to listen to the anecdotal information, but our job in order to make it more usable is to make sure there is always that flow and respect for the empirical information alongside. And it's never really had for me such a light shone on it. So that's my first lesson learned. And my second one is about people's appetite for pace. I think, again, this is maybe are in our kind of global point of being, that we have many crises taking place, but let's just pick three. We have the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis and the nature connection crisis. If you just take those three, it encourages us all to have a sense of urgency and a sense of pace. But this has been approached very much as this is a nature-led piece of work. If it was on land, we all have got a sort of sense of, okay, you have a ploughed field and then you leave it alone. And we all kind of know what succession will look like. And the first year it will be a bit grassy. The next year it will be a bit scrubby. And then maybe after about 15 years, you might start seeing some trees coming out. And everyone can deal with that pace a lot better. They still get a bit impatient, but actually people understand that pace. It's been 5 years. The changes that we're seeing on one level are absolutely magnificent, but this is succession, marine seabed succession, and it's taking place and it takes time, and we've all just got to be patient and let nature do the process it's going to do. And so what I've learned about is that the challenge of holding that pace with everyone. Why can't this happen faster? It's like, wow, it took like millennia for these habitats to form, a decade for them to be trashed. Can we just all breathe for a minute and just go, this has been a really exciting 5 years. The next 5 years is going to be even more exciting, and just allow nature to lead, I think.
Yeah, it's that blinking, that damn TikTok generation, isn't it? Impatient. Yeah.
I'm sorry it doesn't suit you that nature's taking a bit of time to do this.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for putting that point so succinctly and engagingly. I appreciate that. I was on the journey with you. So just very conscious of people's times and not taking up too much of your evenings. Just going to start asking questions about looking forward then. Actually, to stick with you, Henry, just for this one, if you could put one ask to government off the back of what is happening in Sussex, what would it be?
I'd like the MMO to explain really clearly what they're doing in order to reflect the brilliant work that has been done by Sussex IFCA and show what they're doing for our nearshore marine conservation zones with their role of influence that they have in them, and also with our offshore marine conservation zones. So that's my next on my list.
Nice, I like it. And to you, Lewis, looking ahead 10 years, what does success look like for Sussex? That's hard to say. Sussex is inshore waters, and what is the single greatest risk to getting there?
Oh, God, the greatest risk is probably something really boring around adaptability in government, because things take a really long time, and what we need is really adaptable management and change that allows us to move with the times, and we don't have that. That's a national problem of things being quite slow. We want things to happen quite very fast as people that are advocating for positive change. I think that pressure is probably, can we act in the right time frame when things do change and things need to happen? But more exciting stuff about success. God, I've got a long list of things that I think could happen, but just general regeneration of our marine environment and continued positive collaborations. I'm having so much fun in my job, being able to talk to people not here, about the work that we're doing and just continuing that into the next decade.
I like it. That wasn't a boring answer at all. That was great. I appreciate it. and George, then finally, rewilding takes decades, but political and funding cycles are far shorter. How do you sustain the institutional commitment needed to see a project like this through? Actually, maybe that could be one for you as well, Lewis.
So I think we have these targets, that we have these sort of stipulations in legislation already, right? So the ecosystem-based approach, that's something that's in the Fisheries Act that we have to be doing. So I think that the political avenue is already been laid out. What I think just sort of, I really related to the way you phrased it for Henry, which was, if you could ask the government for something, what would it be? I think the answer to that, to me, is really easy. And I think this is something that would almost certainly have big benefits for both the inshore sustainable fishing community and also the environment, which is better representation of inshore small scale fishers in those broader, like larger scale management decisions. So whether that's specifically fisheries management or marine spatial planning more generally, what I think would be massively beneficial for everyone is if there were mechanisms which facilitated those opinions of, like I say, those small scale inshore fishers which aren't as well resourced and aren't as able to sort of have the flexibility and the resource to contribute to those discussions. Let's give them a little bit of help and get their voices represented in these, like I say, national decision-making processes. And I think that off the back of that, we will have more sustainable management, and we will also have better, like healthier, more thriving inshore communities. So that would be my, I think that politically, everything that we need is there. It's about resourcing and making sure that, again, we have the right information. We've spoken a lot about evidence bases. And another thing that we spoke about is anecdotal information, like Henry was making that point really effectively. So I would call that local ecological knowledge. And I think that if we can better incorporate that into the decision-making process, that will be of massive benefit.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for those thoughts, George. And Lewis, I'm aware that I sort of half threw it to you as well. So just to give you another moment to share your thoughts on anything there.
Honestly, I was too enthralled in listening to George. I actually forgot what the question was. So no.
Okay, great. Well, look, I think that's a great place to wrap it up. It's a bombshell of an ending, but thank you so much. Thanks to all of you, George, thanks Lewis, and thanks Henry for your time and energy and sharing your insights and perspectives on this, what is essentially a very, very positive development and story. And thank you everybody for tuning in and being a part of this conversation as well. You've all been wonderful. If you've enjoyed this roundtable session, be sure to come back next week when we will tackle the week's biggest story at the same time, same place. We will be looking at news developments around the AMOC. So do check out the Oceanographic platform for the latest details on our live Ocean Talks events, as well as our printed magazine and everything else that we have to offer, which leaves me with nothing more to add other than have wonderful evenings, everybody. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time. Take care.